Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Housing Bureau for Seniors, I'd like to welcome you to the Senior Living Week and today's workshop. I'm Janet Hunko, and I work with a great team at the Housing Bureau for Seniors. The purpose of Housing Bureau's annual Senior Living Week event is to bring together the people who provide senior services, resources, and products with those who need them. We're grateful to the many sponsors who have contributed to the funding for Senior Living Week, and that allows us to offer these events for free. A special thanks to our event sponsor, Bassett Murray Law Group, PLLC, our Grab-A-Go sponsors, All Seasons of Ann Arbor, Cambrian Memory Care and Assisted Living, Story Point Senior Living, Silver Maples of Chelsea Retirement Neighborhood, Brookhaven Manor Senior Living, and Senior Helpers. The Housing Bureau for Seniors is a community-anchored program of community health services at Michigan Medicine. We rely on supporters like you so we can continue to provide this valuable programming. Finally, we want your feedback, so please keep an eye out for a Senior Living Week survey, which will hit your email box around October 1st. So it's my pleasure to introduce our workshop topic and guest speaker for today. Today we have Karen Montz, who is a Master's in Psychology, MSLBSW. She is currently the Director of Grief Support Services and Practice Manager of Counseling Services for the North Star Care community, where she is responsible for overall leadership and directing of grief support services for Arbor Hospice, Hospice of Michigan, and Anchor's Pediatric Program. She assists with practice, policy, and educational needs for the spiritual care and social work staff. She developed the Bereavement Risk Assessment, which has been instrumental in assisting clinicians with determining risk. Her proudest achievement is leading a production of a program for Detroit Public Television called When Families Grieve, a Community Discussion. She is a licensed bachelor social worker with a certificate as a trauma and loss specialist through the National Institute for Trauma and Loss in Children's, and holds an MS in psychology from the University of Michigan. She also serves on the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization's Bereavement Steering Committee, as well as a participant with National Partnership for Healthcare and Hospice Innovation. So you're in for a great treat. That's a excellent bio, and it looks like we're going to be talking to an expert for today. Just a reminder that North Star Institute is providing one continuing education for nursing and social work. In just a moment, we're going to be completing a survey, asking you to complete a survey for those of you who are interested in receiving that certificate. You'll have to fill out the certificate before and then at the end, and then we will send another survey for you to complete so you can get your certificate. So before we actually turn it over to Karen, I'm going to run a short poll, and we'll go from there. Okay. Thank you for that. So for today's presentation, Karen will be pausing periodically to ask for questions. In order to ask a question, if you could utilize the Q&A function on your toolbar for this Zoom webinar. Click on the Q&A, type in your question, and we'll be checking in periodically to make sure that we answer any questions that you have, or that Karen does. And with that, no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Karen, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Janet. Janet has been great and great to meet you. I wish I could see all of your faces, but hopefully you will find this to be a very informative and helpful discussion. And I love the fact that we're acknowledging Senior Living Week, and there are so many great programs and activities and presentations that are happening this week to assist us all in having a better quality of life, especially during this time. Any information we can get and use is going to be valuable. Gosh, even though I can't see you, I would love to kind of get to know you. So if you want to put in the chat what brings you here today, that would be great. Maybe you're a social worker, you're a nurse, or a professional, and you want to get more information to help others. Or, maybe you are someone who struggled with grief, loss, or isolation, and you want to, just get some information to help cope better during this season. Or maybe you're a little bit of both. Or if you just want to tell me what organization you're with, I just encourage you to go ahead and use that chat and put in that information, so we can kind of get to know you a little bit. All right, we got social workers from Michigan Medicine. Wonderful. Go Maize and Blue, right? All right, we got some social workers that work with seniors. Love it. Meals on Wheels. Wonderful. We got some counselors that work with senior services organizations. We got Julie Capra here. She's awesome. Advisor for Arbor Hospice. And we've got Jasmine, a social worker. Got some social workers with Michigan Visiting Nurses. So a lot of social workers. And I'm a social worker also. And so I'm glad to see you are all here. Thank you so much. That helps a lot. So let's go ahead and go into the presentation. We were asked to talk a little bit about loss, grief, loss, and social isolation. So this is a hot topic right now, of course. We weren't saying much about grief, loss, and social isolation this globally, and until the pandemic. So it's been a year that I don't think anybody, it would be hard pressed to find anybody who says they have not met with grief, loss, or the challenges of social isolation. That would be hard. That would be difficult to see if we found anyone who could say that, right? Here is the disclosure statement, and Janet already did a great job with explaining the 1.0 CEs. One available, you have to stay till the end of presentation, and then you will receive a link to complete the evaluation, and then you will get your certificate. There's no conflict of interest, no commercial support, and this program not co-provided. And we won't be mentioning any drugs, I don't believe, but we just wanted to make sure we give you this information for the disclosure. Right? Here are the learning expectations. So we're going to talk about different losses from the pandemic. We're going to, what does it mean when we talk about amplify grief? Okay, there's a new word we also started using quite a bit in the grief and loss industry. What's the difference between social isolation and loneliness? They're used interchangeably sometimes, but you know what? There is a difference. And we're going to talk about maybe some health risks associated with social isolation. So let's start by talking about grief. Yeah, that little simple word, which comes from the old French word meaning grieve, a heavy burden, right? So pre-pandemic, there's a lot of social workers here. So if I was coming to do this presentation to you about grief and loss, and we were not in a pandemic, most of you would say, yes, I got that. As I talk about grief represents a set of behaviors that are normal reaction to loss or change. As I talked about, it's normal, natural, and it's individual and unique. Most of you, social workers, or even those who are not social workers, pretty much this is all elementary terms. But what does it mean in the context of COVID times? Okay, let's take a deeper dive. So grief represents a set of behaviors and feelings that are a normal reaction to a significant loss or change. But now we're talking about loss in unprecedented times, right? So now we're talking about loss that is going to be defined and experienced very differently, because this is loss in unprecedented times. We have never experienced loss in this type of situation before. So the normal definition that we give to loss has expanded during this time. And even the normal definition that we've given to grief has been amplified, it's magnified. And when we talk about pre-pandemic, it's absolutely normal to experience the loss of an object, a role, or person, which is, what grief is most associated with, object, role, or person. So we always say too, where does your pet fit in there? Right? Object, role, person. I think we just need to add loss of a pet because, you got to have that in there. That's a significant loss too. But when you talk about roles, objects, or persons, pre-pandemic, yeah, we get that. We got it. Let's talk about COVID times. It's multiplied, right? People are not just experiencing the loss of a person, but it is going to be compounded by the loss of a role and even objects at the same time. Finances, their pets, all of that. Other loss types became very common, right? Even when we talk about social isolation, just losing that connection. And then it's normal, natural, and necessary response. That's what grief is. There has been this huge push to add grief to a mental health disorder, and, people have fought against that for years. I think it's going to be changing this year. But the bottom line is it's still normal, it's still natural, and it's still necessary. But here's a better question. What is normal? That it's hard to say that word right now. And we've heard a lot of that. Return to norm. What will norm look like? Absolutely, since 911, the norm changed. When I say to my niece, who's 17 years old and doesn't remember pre 911, and so she doesn't know the fact that we could go into the airport. I remember walking my mom in the 80s into the airport and onto the airplane to help her with her bag, and standing at the gate, and there were smoking sections, and and going through security was no big deal. You just you went through, and if a metal detector went off, then they pulled you to the side. But we know that has all changed. So what is norm for me is very different than my niece. So we know that the norm will change. What is normal now? What is normal when we talk about grief? It is individual and unique for each person, but in this season, we have seen that there's shared loss. There is a grief experience that is global. So there's almost a comfort in that we are all uniquely tied together in this situation. So let's dig even a little deeper. Let's talk about then, what does COVID-19 losses look like? Because it was very different, right? Very different, but also very similar. Again, we're talking about compounded. We're talking about multiplied. So direct personal losses. How many of you can say you experienced one of these? Whether it was the death of a loved one or someone you know. Losses of finances. We saw people losing jobs, family members. We saw the loss of what people call their freedom or autonomy, the right to make choices, security, not feeling very safe, the ability to socialize. That was a huge loss. The ability to participate in activities that I have participated in before. So now this is what I mean when we say compounded, right? Can you agree with that? When you look at that, how many of those can you check off? I mean, I can look at this and check off a few of those. And I imagine that any of your clients or any of you personally could check off at least 2 or 3 of those that you've experienced, right? And whether it's primary or secondary, primary meaning it was, a direct loss, secondary meaning it was a result of the other loss. So, for example, then the loss of a job then caused the loss of finances, or caused the loss of, your ability to go to the gym because you couldn't pay for the gym anymore. So you have primary losses, those losses also that affect you directly. Then you have what we call indirect personal losses. So was anybody else like me? Last year, I was writing so many condolence notes on social media. So many condolence notes. I think it was probably 2 or 3 a day sometimes. So now I am grieving the fact that a dear friend of mine is grieving. I may have not known the person, but they're grieving. I had friends who lost parents, friends who lost siblings, acquaintances who lost parents, or acquaintances who lost coworkers. And so because they hurt, I hurt. So it was then what you call this indirect personal loss. And then let's talk about the fact of global loss, definitely global losses. I honestly think about, I was on a cruise last year in January 2020, and that's when they were first starting to talk about COVID. I was in Miami, stopped at the grocery store, couldn't find a cart. I saw a little older gentleman and his wife. I went over, asked could I have their cart when they, emptied it out, and they did that. And we just got to talking, and Kobe Bryant had just died. And that came up in the conversation. I don't know how. Somebody else walked over to the car where we were. I can't remember why they walked over, but it ended up being a grieving session as this gentleman just started to cry and talk about, what that loss meant to him. And I recognized how many people across the world was grieving the loss of Kobe Bryant, got on the ship, got off the ship, and came home to a couple of weeks later, a pandemic, right? And so we've had this global loss and this global grief that we have been experiencing for several years. And again, that doesn't, the loss of Kobe Bryant may have not affected you as much as maybe somebody else, but I'm just speaking to the fact that there was millions of people who were touched by that loss. And then we went right into a pandemic, and millions and millions and millions of people experiencing what we call these direct personal losses. Compounded losses, we've talked about that. And what about assumptive world loss? Now that's a new term, right? Assumptive world is our beliefs and our values that guide us and govern us and orient us. Is our world, okay? It is what we assume to be normal. My child will go to elementary school. My child will go to junior high. My child will go to high school. My child will go to college. My child will then get married and have children, and then hopefully some grandchildren. In our mind, this is what the normal path that is supposed to happen. But when a parent, for example, loses a child, their whole world is shattered. And now it has to be a rebuilding of this world around me. This is very similar to what millions of people experienced during COVID-19. Exactly. It is this is not normal. This isn't supposed to happen. Who has to go into their home and lock down? I remember when it first happened, when we first went into social isolation or physical isolation, I remember feeling like this is like a horror movie. Didn't I just watch this in a horror movie? I'm like, this feels like a horror movie. But the reason why is because our assumptive world was shattered. We're now in this stage, even though we're still in this pandemic and we're still trying to move our way through it, we're now, most of us probably can agree, in a state where we are rebuilding our assumptive world now. We're rebuilding. It is becoming redefined. We are rebuilding what is considered normal. there are some things that will now never leave, much like 911. Now you have security that is more heightened. The doors to the plane are locked. As a matter of fact, I was just on a trip, and as I'm sitting in the plane, I noticed the stewardess went and she stood right in front. I thought it was very interesting. She stood right in front of the doors, where we could see her visibly. She stared straight ahead with a very serious look on her face. And I'm thinking, what is she doing? Then a few minutes later, I saw like a door open and I saw her move. And really what it was the pilot had to go to the restroom. And so she was standing there and standing guard. And I thought, wow, I've never seen that before. Well, that's the norm though now for the industry. There will be norms. What do you think are some of those things that will be norms now? Go ahead and put those in the chat. What do you think that some things that will now be the norm that probably won't go away? Or what maybe some other losses that I didn't put up here that you think should be up here as well? Let me see if I can hit chat without messing up the whole thing. All right. Okay, yeah, we've got the global economy has been shaken. The connection between various nations has been shaken. Absolutely. Masks are here. I think masks are here to stay. In many nations, masks were a norm during heightened flu seasons and things like that. I think now we'll see it a little bit more. And then some people look at the mask as a loss of my autonomy when they were mandated. Virtual learning is here to stay. Virtual support groups are here to stay. Social distancing, not engaging in as much physical affection with those outside. That was definitely a loss. People will sanitize better. Yes. I always wash down the carts anyway, before even the pandemic, but I tell you now I'm real careful about it. Therapy being virtual, absolutely. There are some very positives and some good things that will come out of this. Things that we were afraid to venture into before. And now, yes, COVID-19 has forced us to do, and it's a good thing. Planning for family not being in hospital. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, people having to die alone in the hospital, that was unheard of. And we will be much more aware of the condition of the least among us. Spoken like a true social worker. Absolutely, LaRon. Essential but previously unrecognized workers. Who ever recognized the McDonald's workers and the Walmart workers, right? But they were our saving grace during this time. We are very grateful for the Walmart workers and the McDonald's workers who never stopped. So very awesome responses. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on here. So what does grief feel like? We talked earlier about what is normal. So what does grief feel like? When we talk about grief, usually we refer to the emotional. People will say, oh, the sadness, the anger, the hurt. But we forget there are very physical, spiritual, and mental. And the one word that is missing up here is social dimensions to grief as well. So yes, emotional, anger, sadness, guilt, anger, sadness, guilt, all of that. And then also, then we have the physical, which is, how many times has somebody's been grieving and they say, I haven't been able to eat, I haven't been able to sleep. Spiritual, just exploring what is the meaning of this? What does God mean in this? Who is God in this? Drawing away from the spiritual, drawing to the spiritual, the mental, the forgetfulness, the can't concentrate. And then the social, the fact that I withdraw. So that's what grief looks like normally. But we had a phenomenon that has happened during this time of COVID. You can see the arrows are up. everything ramped up. We saw everything ramped up, and I'm sure you did as well. So when you talk about spiritual, people begin to really search for the meaning in my loss, if it was COVID, and then also even losses outside of COVID that has happened. We know that their losses have escalated because people stopped going to hospitals for other things, like the fact that they were having chest pains and they were afraid to go to the hospital. So we saw increases of other losses as well. People could not go to their church or their synagogue or their religious institution. So in some way you saw an increase or even a decrease in spiritual activities, right? What about the physical? How many people can say they gained weight during COVID-19, right? A lot of people are saying, I gained weight during COVID-19. I heard somebody on the radio, she was very comforting because she said, listen, she said, I had to stop worrying about the fact that I gained weight because it was making me depressed. And she said, and I had to start realizing that just stop, you'll get it together. That's what you call having some self-compassion, right? Having some self-compassion. We weren't moving as much, the physical. We weren't able to move as much as we used to. Sleeplessness went up because of anxiety. Sleeplessness increased because of COVID. I mean, sleep increased because of COVID. People found themselves sleeping more because of the fatigue that went along with COVID. What about the cognitive? I experienced this. How many of you experienced this? Time and day confusion. As we were isolated, when we were at the height of this isolation, I just remember thinking, what day is it? What time is it? It just felt disorienting. And the reason it felt disorienting, again, because our assumptive world was shattered. We couldn't concentrate. People were having a hard time concentrating and kind of just doing the day-to-day. And so everything is amplified. Normally during grief, yes, people withdraw and they isolate, but you had the phenomenon of cabin fever. People were sick of isolating, even if they were grieving. Relationship stress, man, that's normal during grief. But what we're seeing, how many of us begin to see more and more divorces, right? And they said that there were reasons for that. Well, there were several. One being the fact that the pandemic just increased mental health stressors. So people begin to have a lot of mental health crisis, anxiety, depression, all of that. And it took a toll on the marriages. Financial stressors, this one partner or both lost their jobs and it just took a toll on the marriage. Also, the other things that they said is the possibility that, just being together, you got to know somebody that you only saw maybe, 5-6 hours a week. Sometimes you saw a lot of that with celebrities, right? That they were in this lockdown together, and as celebrities that were married, they only saw each other as husband and wife, maybe an hour or two here and there. It was a very long distance marriage. And so all of that, it all amplified. So imagine somebody, your clients that are grieving, that not only were they experiencing the normal reactions of grief, but the pandemic caused the magnification of all of that, even the sorrow. And what about fear and anxiety, right? And so let's talk a little bit about fear and anxiety, because that was one of the primary grief experiences that we saw. As a matter of fact, when we look at the boxes here, I'll go to that last one. Somebody who was I'm very close to, who experienced some anxiety and panic attacks pre-pandemic, began to experience anxiety and panic attacks. And, and so in helping that person with that experience, when we got into the heart of the pandemic, we were talking and they said to me, you know what? I feel kind of comforted because everybody feels like I do now. I don't feel so alone in my anxiety now. Yeah, a lot of us were experiencing anxiety based on the information we were getting or not getting, because nobody had the answers to this. Um, the fact of the illness, and what do I need to do to keep myself safe. We felt very vulnerable. I can remember going to the grocery store, correct, and taking 15 minutes to get ready to go to the grocery store, and then when I come home it takes an hour to unpack my groceries because I got to wash everything down and sanitize my clothes, all of that. And then so we just did not feel very safe or secure. Often you'll hear this analogy of what's fear and what's anxiety. Both are very similar, of course, so we can use them interchangeably at times, but we know that anxiety sometimes speaks more to a disorder or a complication, whereas fear is most time defined as that normal fight and flight that we were born with, that we were equipped with. And so if somebody tells me, if somebody says to me, there are snakes in that jungle, and I go to walk through the jungle and I'm okay, I see a snake and then I'm scared to death, so I run, right? So I'm okay. I'm walking to the jungle. I'm like, I'll be fine. I'll be fine. And you walk through, or maybe you're a little nervous about it, but then you see the snake and that fight or flight takes place, and well, in my case, will probably be flight. I'm not going to fight, but it would be flight. But anxiety is, the fact that, somebody says it possibly could be snakes in that jungle, or maybe somebody doesn't say it. Maybe just in your mind, you think, what if there's snakes in that jungle? And so that makes you feel like, I don't even want to walk through the jungle. I have an anxiety about it because it could possibly be snakes in there. And so that's what we really begin to experience, a lot of anxiety that I don't see it, but I anticipating that this could happen to me. And then also people are still struggling with, this will not end. What will happen? And as counselors, that is where we, in our own way, not only need to validate and normalize, but also provide some sense of hope, some sense of hope. And what about, we talked about the assumptive world, but what about classic conditioning too, right? And we know Pavlov's conditioning, where there are sights and there are sounds that will begin to trigger certain emotions. We'll see, there's a grief pandemic scale that is coming out soon. And the grief pandemic, it's actually already out, but it's not being used globally as yet. But the thing about this pandemic and grief scale, early data is showing that people may struggle with complicated grief for months and maybe even years to come because of the pandemic. And when you talk about this classic conditioning, what are some of the sounds and sights of the pandemic that, even though we're not, maybe as it was last year, that it triggers some kind of emotion in you, right? Like I can remember there was a commercial that kept showing during the pandemic when it first started, and that commercial came on all the time. And now when I hear that sound, I'm very aware that it affects my stress response. I feel my heart move. I feel my gut sink, so there's this classic conditioning that all of us should be aware of, whether not a counselor, be aware of, and especially those as counselors should be aware of, because we will need to be able to ask those questions to people in time as they're struggling with anxiety and fear and depression. You will need to be able to say to them, what triggered that crisis? What triggered your response to that? Have to help people to find out what is the trigger. So I'm going to stop right there, and before we proceed, and ask, are there any questions? Any questions? And Janet said you can put those in the Q&A if you like. Now take a look at the chat here. The change in perception of those receiving unemployment benefits. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, what in the middle of the pandemic, what we have to make sure we do not, sorry about that. I was pretty sure I put that on on silent. What we have to most definitely be aware of is the fact that we do not lose our compassion. And as people are falling on different sides of their beliefs regarding masks and vaccines and the disease and all of that, really what we are seeing is sometimes people are so afraid that you're seeing almost a lack of challenge with compassion. So we do have to be very careful with that. All right, I don't think I'm seeing any Q&A, so we'll proceed on. So why is this? Why is grief challenging during COVID-19? I mean, you could probably answer some of this question. You can go ahead and put that in the chat if you would like. I'll give you some of the things that I have here. First of all, inability to experience a proper mourning ritual. We know that funerals and memorial services have a very therapeutic benefit. They're not just there just because to go and spend a lot of money on, something. They really have a huge therapeutic benefit. But what we saw was the fact that people could not have a proper mourning ritual. Your clients or you yourselves may be emotionally affected by that for time to come in the future. This inability to touch and hug. Actually, I remember last year early on when they were not having funerals or it was very limited. Somebody was heading to a funeral and I was doing a Facebook Live presentation on grief and loss. And somebody responded and said, I can't stay. I'm on the way to my sister-in-law's funeral. I have a question. How do I convey to them that I love them and I care since I can't touch them and I'll have on a mask? Now that was a deep question. Assumptive world. That never happens. So I believe what I said to her was, utilizing verbal gestures like, this and, anything you can do non-verbally to convey, hold the heart, to convey. And so I gave some advice, other people chimed in, but man, that was a huge loss, the ability to touch and hug, right? Self-care activities are important. They were definitely important during the pandemic because when stress is heightened, that's when you have to increase your self-care. But we couldn't do that. People couldn't go to their gym, they could not go to the movies. Me, I love going to movies and restaurants. Couldn't do that. That was my self-care, to hang out with friends at movies and restaurant. We saw these, again, global stressors. And here's the interesting thing about that, and I'll use a personal story again. I like to use personal stories because I think, it helps us to grasp the concept of what is being stated. And I remember a dear friend of mine who talked to me and said that she had 18 losses of family members of close friends because of COVID. And when she finally reached out to me is when she said, I need a counselor. And this isn't the person who would normally reach out to say, I need a counselor. She said, I need a counselor. Can you help me? And when I contacted her and we talked, that's exactly what she said. I said, why didn't you reach out to me before? And she talked about she had been going through depression for weeks. And she said, everybody's going through something. So she just didn't feel comfortable with talking to anybody because all the people that she normally would get counseling from was also experiencing loss and tragedy. So we did have this situation where people who would normally reach out to someone couldn't reach out because of various reasons. So what we also saw was this disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief meaning my normal ability to get support was not there, which makes me squash my grief. And that is exactly what happened with her. Also, the fact that I heard somebody share a very interesting story. They talked about how um, when you lose someone outside of COVID, and what is the first thing people said during when COVID was really bad and somebody maybe died at 30 or 40 years old or something like that, or 50, or any age, but especially if it seemed unusual, then people would say, did they die of COVID? That was what came out. And the person would say no. And sometimes the response is, oh, okay. And what that says to that person is, but you don't have a right to grieve and die of COVID. So that's just a reminder to us that we must always validate loss. We definitely saw an inability to have this physical social contact, right? And somebody said that I needed 3 things: kindness, kindness from others, commiseration with those who have had similar experiences. Okay, so this camaraderie with those who have had serious experiences, the similar, and continuity. That's good. Those are good. That life will go on under the pandemic. That's very good. Very good. Let's see if I see anything else. Yeah, people, definitely inability to engage in self-care, mental health. Right. Inaccessible grief support groups, right? Because, we moved everything into virtual, but it took time for people to learn how to use the virtual format. So you had people that were used to going to their support groups every week. That was their self-care, and all of a sudden it stopped. That was very challenging. Now let's talk a little bit about social isolation. Those were some great comments. Let's talk about social isolation or physical isolation, because honestly, they were saying you have to socially disconnect, socially isolate. But reality is people found creative ways to socially connect, didn't we? We found how to socially connect. We started doing game night, Zoom game nights. I mean, we started having all kind of Microsoft team meetings. I mean, there was a lot of social connecting going on. TikTok blew up. Facebook blew up. Everybody went on Facebook. People who never said they would have a Facebook account went on Facebook. So we found creative ways to socially connect, but there still was this physical disconnection, right? Which is very challenging because humans, we are social by nature. We're drawn to socialize. If you're drawn to never socialize, we know that we're usually looking at something that may be, related to some type of mental health challenge, because by nature, innate, we have to socialize. And now we're being told you cannot come together. That was completely outside of what is human and what is normal. Now, what we have to remember, though, is social isolation is different than loneliness. Loneliness is a feeling of being isolated. So you can be in a room full of people. You can be at a football game at the Maize and Blue U of M big house and still feel lonely, because it is a feeling of being isolated. We hear this often with people who are grieving. They can be in a room full of people and still feel lonely because I'm disconnected from another human being that was important to me. There's something missing in my soul, and that makes you feel lonely. Actually, research has shown there's not a high correlation between loneliness and social isolation. You would think that it is, but it's not actually is. It can happen, but it's not actually a strong correlation. But the whole term of social isolation or social disconnecting or social distancing, or social distancing, again, we socially distanced, they said, but really we were physically distancing, but we were still socially connecting. but it's a new term to most. When I was a little girl back in the way day, right? You heard the term quarantine a lot. It was just beginning to not be heard when I was a little girl, because I remember asking my mama, what does that mean, quarantining? And I would see TV shows where they would talk about quarantine. And, I didn't really understand that. But what my mom had to help me to understand was, when you had chicken pox and measles and pre-vaccine, it was normal when a family member got chicken pox, everybody in the house had to stay in the house in quarantine, right? And so by the time I became, of course, a little girl, the vaccines were in full use. And so there was not this need of the whole house quarantining. As a matter of fact, I can remember very clearly being in school and the whole school having chicken pox. And and I'm still there, and I used to always think that I had a natural immunity, because my classroom all through elementary, junior high, high school, I always had a class where the people would get chicken pox and most would be out. The whole class would be out, and it would just be like me and a couple other people. I'm like, I have a natural immunity. Ha. Well, then I got in my 20s and I had the chicken pox. So there went that. But so quarantining, all of this was a new term. We also chose to continue to socially or physically distance because of love. How many people said, I'm not going to mom's house because I don't want to, I'm out and about a lot and I don't want to bring the COVID to her. We saw this, people really being compassionate towards other, but it also challenged all segments of society. None of us were alone, right? Everybody was challenged by this. How do you do the work that you do and continue to physically distance? So for public health professionals and mental health professionals and policymakers, how do you continue to do that? We were all forced to deal with grief alone, right? And research has shown that this social isolation and loneliness both are related to depression, cognitive decline, and health issues like heart issues, and other physical ailments. So while we could not go to the hospital or to the doctor like we normally would, the challenge is the fact that the social isolation can affect us physically as well. So that is what this isolation looked like during the pandemic. I'm glad that we are starting to physically connect a little bit more. Just because we could not maintain that for a long time. But we still have to be mindful of our seniors and others who are immunocompromised that cannot. I have friends who have immune system ailments and they still cannot go around people, because even with the vaccine, the doctors have told them, we'll give you this, but man, your immune system and the challenge that you have, you might get 20 to 30% protection out of this. So we have to still be reminded that even though we're returning to some sense of normalcy and connecting, there's a huge population of people that still cannot. And somebody said, yes, people are getting used to and enjoying virtual a lot more. Absolutely, they sure are. Okay. Let's look at some of the figures. Pre-COVID loneliness and isolation. We already, even before COVID, loneliness and isolation, said that 35% of adults age 45 and older are lonely, and 43% age 60 and older are lonely. So as somebody talked about, we're getting used to virtual. I think we better really tap into that, especially for our people who are 60 and older, and again, are immunocompromised, so that we can help to combat this feeling of loneliness. 22% of adults in the US say they often or always feel lonely. That's a pretty big number. They feel like they don't have companionship and feel left out. Okay, we're going to move on and begin to wrap up. We just got a few minutes, and I want to allow some time for questions, but I want to talk about, I've given you a lot of information and facts and figures. And again, I'm going to say now, if you have any question or answer, go ahead and post it, put it in the Q&A. But let's talk about all of this information. What do we do about it? What about social connecting? We still are having to physically distance. So we still should be looking for ways to socially connect, strengthen the social bonds, and do it safely. How do we continue to seek human connection? This is so important because our tendency is to want to do this, technology. But you really do, you can do some human connection on technology. I'm not negating that. But safely, we need to get up and make a human connection. Even if that means, let me get off of Facebook and go and actually call somebody on the phone and have a human conversation. Seek means I have to put effort into it. It doesn't have to be a deep conversation, right? Active involvement in a religious organization can be a source of social support, and this affiliation may help ease an individual's feelings of loneliness or social isolation. So this came from research. You have to continue to be open to new connections. Keep thought records. You know, as social workers, those who are social workers or LPCs here, you know that when you're helping people, you often will say, what triggered that anxiety? What triggered that crisis? But everyone should be keeping a record of what triggered, keeping a journal, and not being afraid of counseling. I think last year, every counselor had a counselor, right? Then there's this concept of active meditation that I heard somebody talk about the other day, which I thought was phenomenal. And he said that he actually sings with the Lion King. And he said, listen, he said, meditation is just not sitting and being quiet and doing deep breathing. He said, I found my deepest meditative moments is when I'm cooking in the kitchen. It's very relaxing for me. He said, there's just something deep and spiritual that happens when I am cooking in the kitchen. I love that. What is your active meditation? Go ahead and put that in the chat. Is it walking? Mine is washing dishes, and I don't know why, but when I'm washing dishes, I'm so in tune spiritually, and I don't know why. But this active meditation, if you have anything that you do that while you're doing it, you're feeling a calmness, and a connection, right? So what may help the grieving process? We know all of these that we have said in the past, you know, getting support, finding a counselor, reading information on grief and loss. It helps to normalize you and validate your experience, joining a support group, and then of course, reflection. What helped you in the past? You know, whenever I do a group with seniors, I always ask them, when you've coped with difficult times in the past, what helped you? Because whatever helped you then, you can probably pull it out your bag to help to amplify it and use it during this difficult time as well. But let's talk about this amplification of grief and some of the more specific stuff. So we know that we talked about this sorrow, right? So what may help? Self-compassion. I had to remind that person who lost 18 people, be compassionate with yourself. It's okay to want a counselor. You lost 18 people in the span of just a few weeks. You need permission to mourn. Give yourself permission to have mourning experiences. What about fear and anxiety? We can't emphasize enough. Counselors, non-counselors, continue to limit our social media and news intake, right? And find ways that we can positively take in good information and even that which gives us hope. There is extreme benefit in doing breathing exercises. I stopped and did it the other day. I was on a airplane going out of the country, talk about fear and anxiety. And so I literally just said, wait, just begin to do some breathing exercises to help to calm down that stress response that I was feeling. What about guilt? People are really struggling with guilt. I had somebody to call me because their parent died of COVID. They had a party, and somebody came and didn't, I won't go into all of the detail, but I'll just say this: a parent died, a lot of people got it, and the person is now struggling with, was it me? Was it somebody else? Who gave it to them? So what do we do about that? We acknowledge that it's there. We forgive. We don't know the answer. We don't know who gave what in this time. So all we can do is practice forgiveness of others and ourselves, and then do this cognitive reframing, thinking differently. And let's see what we have in the chat real quick. People talked about some other things to get through the pandemic. Being compassionate, running, decluttering. That's a good one. This is a good time to do that. Gardening, prayer, cleaning. I tell you, I'm not going to laugh because me and the dishes is a very spiritual experience. Being compassionate. Anger was big, right? Those are great responses. Anger was big during this time and still is. And we just want you to know that it's not unusual to feel angry when dealing with any kind of grief, but especially right now. People are really upset that my assumptive world, when we saw all of those riots and stuff last year, trust you me, all of that was a lot of the social isolation and the anger that was coming because of the isolation. We have to find creative outlets, talk to a friend, exercise, all of those things. And as we wrap up, Alan Wahlfeld is one of my favorite theorists when it comes to grief and loss. And he has 6 tasks a morning that came after Kubler-Ross's 5 stages. And, and so they can apply now. We acknowledge the reality of what has happened. We sometimes have to just embrace the pain. We have to convert this relationship from one that's more physical to sometimes more social. We have all developed a new identity in this. We will always continue years from now to search for meaning in all of this, just like we still do with 911. But we have to continue also to seek support for that. When you self-care for a part, the whole is affected. So make sure that you're doing something for self-care for all of those parts. And just a reminder that self-compassion is simply giving the same kindness to ourselves that we would give to others. And any questions? Are there any questions? And that's the end of the presentation. I do want to remind you that at Arbor Hospice, you can go on arborhospice.org and you can find information on our Grief Journey program, our grief support groups, our Grief is Love Lost video series, and our Notes of Hope that you can sign up for as well. All right, any questions, Janet?
No, I want to thank you very much. I'm not seeing any other questions, just a lot of comments in the chat. This was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you very much, Karen. This has been a very, very wonderful presentation. I do want one bit of housekeeping. In the beginning of our discussion, I talked about sending out another poll about CEs. I'm having some technical difficulties on this end, so you will receive an email with a link to do a survey in order to get your certificate. So look for that in the next day, before the end of the day, actually. If you don't get it, please let me know. Thank you again, Karen. This is absolutely wonderful, and I hope you come back.
Thank you so much, Janet. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the great feedback and questions, comments.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.